Now I know you're excited to finally get started building your very first React application, but we need to download a few tools first before we can get started. So let's jump over to the computer and do that now. Luckily, the very first thing we need downloaded, I'm sure you already have, which is some form of web browser because it's obviously what you're watching this video on. I recommend using Google Chrome because I'm going to be using Google Chrome throughout this entire course and it'll make it easier for you to follow along, but if you really want, you can use your favorite browser instead of using Google Chrome. The next thing we're going to need is a text editor. I recommend Visual Studio Code. It's what I'm going to be using throughout the entire course, so it'll be easier for you to follow along. And also, Visual Studio Code has all of the tools built into it that you need for React, so it makes it incredibly easy to get up and running with, since all you need to do is download Visual Studio Code, and you're able to immediately start writing React code. The next thing we're going to need, which is entirely not optional, is you're going to need Node.js. Now you may already have Node.js installed on your computer, and you can test this by running node-v in the terminal, and I'll show you how to do that in just a little bit. But if you do not have it downloaded, what you want to do is you want to download the long-term support version, this LTS version here, because it's going to be the most stable version for you to use. Lastly, if you are using Chrome, I would recommend using the Chrome DevTools for React Developer Tools extension, which is going to add a new tab to your Chrome DevTools down here, which will make it much easier to debug your React code and see what the errors are that you're having. This will make running through the course so much easier when you run into a problem. If you're not using Chrome, I'm sure there's extensions for browsers such as Firefox or Safari that do exactly the same thing, so just make sure you find those extensions for you. Now that we have all these tools downloaded, let's jump into the Visual Studio Code here, and what you want to do is you want to open up a folder that's going to be where you put your React application. And you need to make sure that your folder doesn't have any spaces in the name. So for example, my folder is called GitHub, there's no spaces in the name. Just make sure you replace spaces with anything such as underscores or hyphens, just no spaces are allowed. Also, you need to make sure that there are absolutely no capital letters in your name in any way, so your folder must be all lowercase and with no spaces. Once you have that done and you're inside of that folder in Visual Studio Code, you can come up to this terminal section and click New Terminal. By default, this keyboard shortcut is going to be Control Shift plus the tilde key, or you can just access it through here. It'll open up the terminal down here for us. Your terminal may look slightly different than mine depending on what operating system you're using and what terminal you're using, but it does not matter for this tutorial or any of the tutorials in this course. So, like I mentioned earlier, you can test your Node version by running node-v, and this is going to print out the version of Node that you're using. If it doesn't print anything out, then that means that you do not have Node installed, and you need to install it, as I mentioned earlier. Next, once you make sure you have Node installed, what you want to do is you want to run the create React app script, which is from npm. And in order to run it without having to install it, we can use what's called npx, type in the name of the package, which is create React app, and then we put a period afterwards. So what this is saying, npx is essentially saying go to npm and download create React app and actually run it for us. And the period just says that we want to actually run this inside the folder that we're already in, which is this GitHub folder or whatever folder you created where your project's going to be built. And when we click enter, this is going to run the script. And this takes quite a while to run, so I'm just going to skip ahead to when it's done, and I'll see you in a little bit. Okay, that is finally done running, and as you can see, it outputted us a few commands. Up here, it tells us all the different things that we can do now that we have this create React app script run. And as you can see, the main thing that we can do is run npm start. And what this is going to do is it's going to start up our development server. It takes a little bit of time to start up the very first time you start it, but as soon as you get it started, it's going to live reload itself every time you make changes to your code, which is really convenient when you want to test your changes. The next command we have is npm run build, and essentially what this does is it takes your development site and it builds it and optimizes it and compiles it so that it runs on a wide range of browsers and is also much quicker than the development environment. And it's going to create a build folder over here on the left, which is going to put all of the code for your application, and it's just going to be much quicker, but you never actually want to do this unless you're deploying your site to some form of production server. The next thing we have is npm test. This is going to run all of the tests inside of your application if you have any. For our purposes, we're not actually going to worry about npm test in this course. The next thing we have down below is npm run eject, and this is also something that we're not going to worry about in this course. Essentially, what this does is it ejects you out of the create React app realm. So what create React app does is it takes all of the behind the scenes work to hook everything up and make React work, and it hides all of that away for you. It just hooks it all up on its own. But if for some reason you need to make changes to that, what this is going to do is it's going to expose all of those files for you so you can actually make those changes for yourself. I'm going to run this real quick so that you can actually see what create React app does behind the scenes. So let's just run npm run eject. I'm not going to recommend that you do this because you're going to have to re-download everything if you do, since it's irreversible. So I'm going to run that real quick, and what it's going to do is you're going to see You just got to make sure you confirm that you actually want to run the eject, because as it says, it's completely permanent. And if we say yes, you see it's going to add a bunch of different files for us. And these files are going to be all of the different config files that Create React App is managing for us. As you can see, I've completely finished ejecting out of the application, and we have a few new files which are created, and they're inside of the folders scripts and config. And essentially these files are just the files that configure everything for React to work properly. So namely, in the config folder, you're going to see we have our Webpack configuration in here. This is most likely what you're going to edit if you actually want to eject out of the application, because you may want to add, remove, or change things in the Webpack configuration, which is doing all of the bundling and transpiling of our application. Also, the scripts folder down here is just exposing the different scripts that we use. So for example, build, start, test, we now actually just have access to those scripts inside of our application, so we can modify them if we want to, or we can just leave them the same. Most likely though, like I mentioned, you're going to be doing this to modify your Webpack configuration, and that's really the only main reason you want to eject from a React application. Modifying, build, start, test, those are just things you're most likely not going to need to mess with too much. But for the most part, like I mentioned earlier, you never will need to eject out of your application, so I'm actually going to go back, re-download everything, and see you when that's finished. Okay, I'm back. I've finally rerun that again, and what we want to do is just start up our dev server to see what we have to start with. And we can do that by just running npm start. So we can just type in here npm start, and like I mentioned, it takes a little bit of time to run up, but as soon as it starts, it's going to open up your browser for you, just like this, and it's going to take a little bit of time to load. Just like I said, the very first time you run it, it takes a little bit of time, and once that's done, we should see our application popping up, and here we go. Let me just zoom this out to the normal zoom, and as you can see, we have the React symbol, as well as we have just some random code that says we can edit this source/app.js and save to reload, and then that essentially is how that hot reloading is work. And we don't really need to worry about this too much, so let's just minimize out of this, because for the rest of this tutorial, I'm just going to go through all of the different files that were generated by Create React App and kind of explain what they're doing. So the very first folder that we have on the left side here is Node Modules. And Node Modules is fairly straightforward. This is just all of the different libraries that you're using. They all get thrown inside of this Node Modules folder here. You don't actually have to worry about anything inside of here. It's absolutely massive. So we can just ignore this for the purposes of the course because it's just library files and nothing that we create. Next, we have a public folder. This public folder is going to contain our index.html, our favicon, and this manifest file. This manifest file is not really something we need to worry about because this is mostly for when we want to do single page applications on a mobile site in offline mode, and we don't want to worry about that in our website. Next thing that we have here is this index.html, and unlike most sites, this is actually very, very bare bones. Normally you have a lot of HTML code in here, but inside of here all we have is a few different links for our manifest file. We have a couple meta tags. As you can see, there's no links for style sheets, no HTML, no CSS, no JavaScript, nothing. All that's in this is just a single div that has the ID of root and then just a fallback no script that tells people that they need JavaScript to run your application because you need JavaScript to run a React application. And that's it. That's all that's in here. Next thing that we have is our source folder, and this is where all of our React code is going to go. So I'm going to skip over this and come back to this last. Now we can go down here, we have a git ignore. Git ignore essentially just tells Git what it needs to ignore, so we don't commit something like Node Modules to our GitHub repository. Next, we have our package lock JSON. What this is doing is it's telling us the exact versions of every single file that we have specified for every single library in Node Modules. This is going to be massive, but that's okay because it's not something that we actually write ourselves. This is automatically generated every time we install a package. Next, we have package.json. This just gives you the details of your different applications, such as the name, version, different dependencies that you have, which in our case, we have React, React DOM, and React scripts, just the basic React dependencies. It also specifies the scripts. As you can see, our start, build, test, and eject scripts, which are what we can run in order to do our dev server, in order to run the production version, whatever we want to do. And it also has a few extra configurations for linting, which will just give us errors for us for when we actually write misconfigured code. And it also tells us what browsers we wanted to support. In production, for example, we're supporting all browsers with over 0.2% use case, while in development, we're only supporting the very latest versions of all the different browsers. And then of course, very lastly, we have a README here, and this is just really basic. It outlines all of the different scripts that we have, our start script, our test script, and really just gives us a little bit more information on how to run our application. You can see this when you go to whatever hosting platform such as GitHub you're using for your Git repository. And then inside of the source here, like I said, this is where all of our application code is going to go. We have our CSS in here, our JavaScript files, our test files, all of our logos. Every single component inside of your site is going to be inside of this source folder somewhere. And the very first place I want to look is index.js, because this is what hooks up our HTML file to our actual JavaScript. And as you can see, the very first thing that this does is it says React DOM.render app, and essentially what that's doing is it's rendering the app version, this app code over here, inside of our DOM at this single root element. And if you remember in that index, we had a root with the ID root, and that's just going to append all of our app code into there. So we can jump into our app.js. I'm not going to deep dive into what the code's doing, that's going to be in the next video in this tutorial, but essentially what this code is doing is it's just rendering all of the application code that you saw when we ran our application. It also imports our logo, it imports our CSS, everything like that gets imported in the JavaScript and not at all inside of the HTML. We also have our test file here, which just runs a very basic test to make sure our application is working, and of course, our different CSS files for how the application is currently styled, and lastly, a logo file and a service worker. This is something we're going to ignore for the purposes of this tutorial because it's just going to be for offline mode, which we're not dealing with in this course. So as a quick recap, we downloaded our browser, our text editor, Node, as well as our developer tools extension in order to make developing with React easier. We also ran create React app, which allows us to set up a React application incredibly easily, and it's what's used by most industries and companies throughout the entire world because of how easy it is to get up and started with. We also went through all of the different files inside of the Create React app, as well as the scripts that you can run with Create React app in order to develop your site and deploy your site. In the next video, we're going to dive into JSX, which allows us to write HTML in our JavaScript and is really what brings React together and makes it so easy to use and why so many people love using it. So I hope you're excited for the next video, and I can't wait to see you there.